Stand at the edge of a canyon at dusk and you will see layers of stone descending into shadow. The top few feet glow in the last light, every crack and color visible. Everything below thousands of feet of compressed history disappears into darkness. That is the timeline of our species. We live in the glow at the surface, where every detail feels close and clear. But 97% of the human story lies beneath, beyond the reach of light, beyond the grasp of memory. Homo sapiens has walked the earth for somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years. The exact number shifts as new fossils emerge and dating methods improve, but the scale remains consistent. Our species is ancient. The first permanent settlements appeared around 12,000 years ago. Agriculture follows shortly after. Writing emerged around 5,000 years ago. Organized religions, legal codes, and monumental architecture all cluster within the same narrow band of time. Everything we call civilization, everything taught in schools and museums, fits into the last 10,000 years of human existence. That is roughly 3% of the total timeline. The other 97% is treated as blank space, prehistory. A long stretch where nothing of significance occurred, where humans wandered, hunted, gathered, and left behind little more than scattered tools and bones. It is assumed that this was all we were capable of. That complexity began only when we settled down, planted crops, and started building walls. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is simply silence. Imagine New York City abandoned tomorrow. No war, no catastrophe, just emptiness. In 1,000 years, the steel and glass towers would begin to buckle. Concrete would crack. Glass would shatter. Vegetation would reclaim the streets. Roots splitting through pavement. Vines pulling down facades. In 10,000 years, the skyscrapers would be little more than unrecognizable mounds of rust and rubble. The subway tunnels might survive longer, carved into bedrocks. Without context, they would appear to be natural caves shaped by water over millennia. In 100,000 years, almost nothing identifiable will remain, only faint chemical traces in the soil, odd concentrations of metals, fragments too small and too scattered to reconstruct into anything resembling a city. This is not speculation, it is geology and chemistry. It is the science of what endures and what dissolves, a field called taphonomy. The implication is clear. The absence of ancient cities in the archaeological record does not prove they never existed. It only proves they did not survive the forces that erase everything given sufficient time. If a civilization rose and fell 200,000 years ago, we would not expect to find its skyscrapers or its streets. We would expect to find nothing at all, or at best, a few anomalies, too ambiguous to interpret with confidence. Throughout the history of archaeology, anomalies have surfaced, fragments that refuse to fit the established narrative. Yet when someone uncovers them, the response is rarely acceptance. It is skepticism, resistance, and often outright dismissal. For most of the 20th century, American archaeology rested on a single foundational claim. Humans first arrived in the Americas roughly 13,000 years ago. They came from Asia, crossing a land bridge exposed during the last ice age, and they brought with them a distinctive style of stone tool known as Clovis points. This was the Clovis first model. It was taught in textbooks, defended in journals, and treated as settled fact. Then in the 1970s, a site in southern Chile began to complicate the story. Monteverde, located along a creek in a lush valley, produced stone tools, wooden structures, and hearths containing preserved organic material. The dating was careful, conducted by multiple labs using different methods. The results were consistent. The site was at least 14,500 years old, older than Clovis, older than the land bridge was thought to be passable. The archaeological establishment did not embrace the discovery, it attacked it. Papers presenting the Monteverde findings were rejected by major journals. Funding for further excavation dried up. The lead archaeologist, Tom Dillahay, faced professional isolation and public skepticism from senior figures in the field. Critics questioned his methods, his conclusions, and his competence. Some refused to visit the site. Others visited and declared the evidence unconvincing, despite the careful stratigraphy and the layers of preserved material that should have been impossible to fake. For nearly 30 years, Monteverde existed in a kind of academic limbo, acknowledged by some, dismissed by others, and largely ignored by the institutions responsible for writing the official narrative of human history. Then in 1997, a group of prominent archaeologists finally visited the site, examined the evidence firsthand, and issued a formal endorsement. Monteverde was real. Clovis First was wrong. The model collapsed quickly after that. New sites emerged across North and South America, some with dates pushing back 16,000 years, 18,000 years, and, in a few controversial cases, even further. The timeline that had been defended with such certainty for decades turned out to be incomplete, built on assumptions rather than evidence and resistant to revision because the consensus was entrenched. This raises a troubling question if the accepted timeline was wrong by thousands of years. For an event as recent as 13,000 years ago, an event within the scope of well-preserved sites, then what else might be wrong about the periods further back? If mainstream archaeology resisted pre-Clovis evidence for 30 years despite clear data, how much resistance would evidence from 50,000 years ago face? Or 200,000 deep in the 97% gap, where preservation is poor, where organic material has long since decayed, where only stone and circumstantial patterns remain? The timeline we are taught is not necessarily wrong because of malice or conspiracy. It is wrong because it is incomplete, because institutions built on certain assumptions resist changing those assumptions, because the longer a model remains dominant, the harder it becomes to dislodge, even when new evidence demands revision. Pre-Clovis was not the first time the timeline has been rewritten. It will not be the last. But it reveals something important. The official narrative of human history is fragile, contingent, and far more recent than it pretends to be. What we call the beginning is only the beginning of what survived long enough to be recognized. What lies before that remains mostly unexamined, not because there is nothing there, but because finding it requires looking in places we have not been taught to search. The 97% gap is not empty because nothing happened. It is empty because something erased what was there. The question is, what could accomplish that? What could erase entire civilizations so completely that not even their names survive? If you're curious enough to keep searching with me, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. And if you're still awake at whatever hour this finds you, drop a comment. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. I'm always wondering who else is out here looking for answers. Because the answer doesn't lie in speculation, it lies in the forces that have shaped this planet long before humans existed, and that continue shaping it even now. These forces are not theoretical. They are documented in ice cores, sediment layers, volcanic ash, and the bones of species that vanished in geological instants. They operate on scales difficult to comprehend from within a single human lifetime, but when viewed across deep time, they reveal a pattern. Earth does not remain stable. It shifts, breathes, and periodically resets itself with a violence that makes the idea of permanence seem like a comfortable illusion. The question is not whether these catastrophic events occurred. The question is what they would have done to any civilization unlucky enough to exist when they arrived. Between roughly 195,000 and 123,000 years ago, the planet endured one of the most severe glaciations in the history of Homo sapiens. This period, known in geological records as marine isotope stage 6, transformed the landscape. Ice sheets kilometers thick covered much of Europe, Asia, and North America. Regions that are now fertile plains were buried beneath glaciers. Sea levels dropped by more than 400 feet as water locked itself into ice. Coastlines extended outward, exposing vast stretches of land that were once ocean floor. Temperate zones shifted toward the equator. Everything north of the mid-latitudes became uninhabitable. The human population, already sparse, contracted into refuge zones near the equator and along coastlines that no longer exist. If any form of organized society had developed before this glaciation, it would have been crushed under the weight of advancing ice or forced to migrate into regions too small and too resource-poor to sustain complexity. Cities, if they existed, would have been ground to dust beneath glaciers. Trade routes would have been severed. Agricultural systems, if any had been established, would have collapsed as growing seasons disappeared and temperatures plunged. This is what catastrophe does. It does not simply destroy, it erases. And when the world stabilizes again, those who rebuild do so believing they are the beginning, when in truth they are only the aftermath. The ice was not the only force at work. Between roughly 135,000 and 90,000 years ago, a series of prolonged droughts turned much of Africa into desert. Lakes dried up, rivers shrank to seasonal trickles, vegetation withered across regions that had once supported diverse ecosystems and human communities. This was not a single drought lasting months or even years. It was a climate regime that persisted for tens of thousands of years, forcing migration, fragmenting populations, and collapsing whatever social structures had formed during wetter periods. Droughts also leave no ruins. Only empty riverbeds, dust where forests once stood, and bones scattered across landscapes too dry to preserve anything organic. Then there is fire. Around 74,000 years ago, a volcano in what is now Sumatra erupted with a force that dwarfs anything in recorded history. Toba was not a typical eruption. It was a supervolcano, the kind that releases energy equivalent to thousands of nuclear detonations in a matter of hours. The explosion ejected thousands of cubic kilometers of rock and ash into the atmosphere, spreading a veil across the planet that blocked sunlight for years. Temperatures dropped. Ecosystems collapsed. If any organized societies existed before Toba, they would have been obliterated not by the eruption itself, but by the long winter that followed. Toba is not unique. It is simply the most dramatic example of a recurring pattern. Earth's crust is unstable. Volcanic activity pulses through regions where tectonic plates collide or pull apart. Some eruptions are small, localized and manageable. Others blanket continents in ash and alter the climate for decades. The interval between supervolcanic events is long enough that civilizations can rise and flourish between them, but short enough that none are guaranteed to survive the next one. Another force with equally powerful effects is the magnetic field. Earth's magnetic poles do not remain fixed. They drift, and occasionally they reverse. Around 42,000 years ago, during an event now called the Lachamp excursion, the magnetic field weakened dramatically. The reversal did not complete, but for several centuries the field offered far less protection from solar radiation than it does today. The upper atmosphere was bombarded with particles that would normally be deflected. Species that depended on magnetic navigation became disoriented. The disruption coincided with shifts in climate and extinctions of megafauna across multiple continents. Whether the weakened field directly caused these extinctions or merely contributed to a cascade of environmental stresses is debated, but the timing is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. But the most disruptive force is water. Sea levels do not remain constant. They rise and fall in rhythm with glaciation. When ice locks up water, sea levels drop, exposing continental shelves that become prime real estate for human settlement. Coastal plains stretch for hundreds of miles beyond modern shorelines. Rivers carve deeper channels through newly exposed land. Entire ecosystems establish themselves in areas that are now underwater. Then the ice melts, sometimes gradually over thousands of years, sometimes rapidly triggered by shifts in ocean currents or the collapse of ice dams holding back vast glacial lakes, unleashing floods powerful enough to drown most coastal regions. The most recent cataclysm on record occurred 12,800 years ago. Known as the Younger Dryas event, it lasted for more than 1,000 years. It disrupted the gradual warming that was pulling the planet out of the last ice age. Temperatures plunged. Glaciers that had been retreating began to advance again. Massive floods were unleashed as ice dams collapsed, releasing trapped glacial lakes in torrents that reshaped river valleys and drowned low-lying regions. Megafauna that had survived the Ice Age did not survive the Younger Dryas. Ecosystems reorganized. The land that once connected islands into continuous land masses fragmented and was swallowed by the sea. If civilizations rose during the calm between these cataclysms, they would have had thousands of years to develop, to build, to accumulate knowledge, long enough to seem permanent to those living within them. But permanence is an illusion. The forces that reset the world do not care about monuments or achievements or the belief that this time will be different. They operate on rhythms older than any species, driven by orbital mechanics, planetary cooling, tectonic shifts, and magnetic cycles that predate humanity by billions of years. This is the mechanism of the 97% gap, not a single catastrophe that wiped out an ancient civilization, but a repeating cycle of catastrophes that ensured nothing could endure long enough to leave the kind of evidence we would easily recognize. The cities would be ground to dust or drowned beneath rising seas. The knowledge would scatter into fragments carried by survivors too isolated to rebuild coherently. And the next civilization rising from those fragments would believe itself to be the beginning when it was merely the latest chapter in a cycle far older than it could imagine. Which raises the question, if the survivors scattered after these catastrophes carrying only what they could remember, where would that memory survive? Not in buildings or tools, those decay or are buried within millennia. The answer lies in the only form that could outlast geological violence, passed forward through generations. It lies in the stories people told when the world went dark. When you listen carefully to the oldest stories from cultures separated by oceans and millennia, you hear the same thing repeated in different languages, carved into different symbols. Not identical stories, not perfect agreement, but a pattern too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. A pattern that whispers the same impossible claim: this world is not the first. Something came before. And whatever it was, it ended. The Hopi people of the American Southwest have maintained oral traditions for longer than most written records have existed. Their elders speak of emergence, of movement through worlds, of endings and beginnings that follow a rhythm older than the tribe itself. According to their teachings, humanity has passed through multiple worlds, each one ending in catastrophe before the next begins. The first world ended in fire. Volcanoes erupted, the ground split open, the sky turned red, and everything burned. Those who survived fled underground, seeking refuge in caves where the heat could not reach them. The second world ended in ice. The earth froze. The sun grew distant. Snow covered the land so deeply that nothing could grow, and those who did not move toward warmer regions perished in the cold. The third world ended in water. The oceans rose without warning. Waves taller than mountains swept across the land. Cities drowned. The survivors built rafts or climbed to the highest peaks, watching as everything below them disappeared beneath the flood. Now, the Hopis say, we live in the fourth world, and like the others, it too will end when its time comes. The details of how vary depending on who tells the story, but the structure remains. Worlds rise, worlds fall, and a remnant survives to begin again. This is not presented as metaphor. It is not taught as a parable about morality or the consequences of sin. It is spoken as history, oral history passed from elder to child across generations so distant that the events themselves predate any calendar we recognize. The Hopi do not claim to know how many cycles have passed before this one, only that this is not the beginning and will not be the end. Thousands of miles to the south, in the pyramids and temples of Mesoamerica, a similar memory is carved into stone. The Maya and Aztec civilizations spoke of the legend of the 5 suns. 4 ages had already risen and fallen, leaving us in the 5th. But what matters is not the number. What matters is how they measured it. Their calendars did not track time as a line stretching forward into an unknown future. They tracked it as a wheel, turning through cycles that spanned thousands of years, with each rotation bringing the world closer to a point of transformation. The long count calendar, carved into stele across the Maya world, counted forward from a creation date in the deep past, and measured intervals precise enough to predict celestial events centuries in advance. The Aztec sunstone, weighing more than 20 tons, encodes the movement of time through epochs, each one marked by its method of destruction. These were not symbolic representations, they were calculations. The Maya built entire cities aligned to mark the transitions between ages. They oriented pyramids to capture the equinox sun at specific moments. They designed plazas to measure the passage of Venus across decades and encoded astronomical cycles into architecture that still functions as an observatory today. They were not guessing about the past, they were recording it, and they were preparing for what the cycles suggested would come again. The pattern they tracked was not abstract. It described fire, wind, flood, and earthquake, forces that match the catastrophic windows documented in the geological record. The Maya did not invent these stories to explain their world. They inherited them from cultures even older, cultures whose cities they built atop, whose knowledge they preserved in glyphs and calendars. On the other side of the world, in the river valleys of ancient Mesopotamia, the Sumerians recorded their own version of cyclical history. The Sumerian king list, one of the oldest written documents ever recovered, divides time into 2 distinct eras, before the flood and after the flood. Before the flood, kingship was said to have descended from heaven to the city of Eridu. 8 kings ruled in succession across 5 cities: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shurupak. These 5 cities may have represented 5 civilizations that existed before our own. When a city or a civilization collapsed or faded, its knowledge was passed on to the next generation through the framework described as the Me. It contains the foundations of civilization: kingship, priesthood, writing, law, craftsmanship, music, and agriculture. After the flood, kingship descended again, this time to the city of Kish. Not invented anew, not discovered through trial and error. It was restored as though rebooting from a backup that had been preserved through the catastrophe. The Sumerians did not claim to be the first civilization. They claimed to be inheritors, preserving and rebuilding what had been granted to them from a world that came before. Their myths describe gods who taught humanity the arts of survival, figures who appeared after the flood, bearing knowledge that should not have existed yet. Enki, the god of wisdom, is credited with warning the survivor Ziusudra to build a vessel before the waters rose. But the warning implies foreknowledge and understanding that the cycle was repeating, that floods had come before and would come again. Similar stories of catastrophe and cyclical destruction persist across many other cultures. Greek myths speak of ages ending in fire and flood, with humanity repeatedly destroyed and recreated. Hindu cosmology describes yugas, vast cycles of time spanning millions of years, each ending in dissolution before the next begins. Norse sagas describe Ragnarok, the destruction and rebirth of the world, with survivors emerging to rebuild in the aftermath. Iranian Zoroastrian texts speak of the world passing through multiple eras, each separated by cataclysm. These cultures never met. They developed on different continents, spoke unrelated languages, worshipped different gods, and organized their societies according to entirely different principles. Yet they all arrived at the same conclusion: this world is not the first, humanity is not the first, and the forces that ended earlier ages are not gone. They are dormant, waiting for the cycle to turn again. What makes these myths more than folklore is their consistency with the forces described in the previous investigation. The fire the Hopi remember matches volcanic winters. The ice they describe matches the glaciations that covered continents for tens of thousands of years. The floods align with the rapid sea level rise that drowned coastlines at the end of the last ice age. These are not religious allegories. They are descriptions of real events, distorted by time but rooted in experiences so catastrophic they could not be forgotten. And if the myths are memory rather than invention, then the next question becomes unavoidable. If earlier worlds existed, if they were destroyed and forgotten, what did they leave behind? The answer would not be found in wood or metal or any organic material that decays within centuries. It would not be recorded in formats we could easily recognize. There is an archive, one written in a language older than any script carved into monuments or spoken in ceremony. It is written in the cells of every human being alive today, not in metaphor, not symbolically, literally written, encoded into the spiraling structures of DNA that define what we are and where we came from. And when researchers began reading that code in detail, expecting to find a straightforward story of gradual evolution and steady expansion, they found something else. They found evidence of catastrophe. They found signatures of populations that should not exist. And buried within the genome itself, they found what might be memory. The first clues lie in DNA that does not come from modern humans at all. It comes from people who no longer exist. In 2010, researchers sequencing the genome of a single finger bone found in a Siberian cave discovered that it did not belong to a modern human or a Neanderthal. It belonged to a previously unknown population, later named Denisovans. They lived across Asia, interbred with early modern humans, and then vanished, leaving no cities, no monuments, no bones, except a handful of fragments scattered across remote sites. But their DNA remains. It survives in modern populations, particularly among people in Melanesia and Southeast Asia, where as much as 5% of the genome can be traced to Denisovan ancestry. Then researchers began finding other fragments, DNA sequences in African populations that did not match modern humans, Neanderthals, or Denisovans. Sequences that suggested interbreeding with yet another archaic population, one that has left no physical trace. They called it a ghost population. DNA from people who do not exist in the fossil record, who were never found, never named, never documented in any way except through the genetic signature they left behind. The question is unavoidable. If entire populations could vanish so thoroughly that only their genetic signature remains, what else has been lost? What knowledge did they carry? Another clue came from what was missing. Human beings, despite being spread across every continent and occupying nearly every climate zone on the planet, possess remarkably low genetic diversity. Far lower than other primates, far lower than most large mammals. Chimpanzees, despite living in a fraction of the territory humans occupy, have more genetic variation between troops than exists across the entire human species. This is not normal. Diversity increases with time and population size. A species that has existed for hundreds of thousands of years and numbers in the billions should display enormous variation, but humans do not. We are, genetically speaking, almost identical. The differences between a person from Scandinavia and a person from sub-Saharan Africa are so minor that they barely register in the overall structure of the genome. We are less like a species with deep evolutionary history and more like the survivors of a recent severe population collapse, and that is exactly what the evidence shows. Not one collapse, multiple collapses, events so catastrophic that they reduced the effective population of humanity to numbers almost too small to sustain a species. The most famous bottleneck occurred roughly 74,000 years ago. Genetic analysis places the global human population at that time at around 10,000 individuals. Not 10,000 in a region, 10,000 total, scattered across Africa and possibly parts of Asia. The entire species reduced to the population of a small town. Most of the genetic diversity that had accumulated over hundreds of thousands of years was erased in what appears to have been a span of less than 1,000 years. The timing aligns with the eruption of the Toba supervolcano, volcanic winter, collapsed ecosystems, a world plunged into cold and darkness for years. The survivors were not the strongest or the largest groups. They were whoever happened to be in the right place when the sky turned black and the temperature dropped, and when the world recovered, humanity did not rebuild its diversity. It expanded from that tiny, surviving population, carrying forward only the genetic variants those few thousand people possessed. But Toba was not the only bottleneck. Earlier events like marine isotope stage 6 and the great megadroughts show similar patterns. Population crashes, genetic diversity erased, a species repeatedly pushed to the edge of extinction. Each time something killed most of humanity, and each time a remnant survived. The question is, who were they? What allowed them to endure when so many others did not? Were they simply lucky, in the right place at the right time? Or was there something about them, something in their biology, their behavior, their genetics, that made survival possible? Recent studies show that 8% of the human genome is not human, it is viral. Ancient retroviruses that infected our ancestors millions of years ago and became permanent, integrating themselves into the DNA of every cell and being passed down through generations like any other genetic trait. They are called human endogenous retroviruses, or HERVs. Most of them are non-functional remnants of infections so old they no longer pose a threat. But not all of them are inactive. Some still function, some produce proteins, some regulate other genes, and some activate under very specific conditions, conditions that the modern world, in its current stable state, does not produce. Researchers studying HERVs have found that certain sequences respond to environmental stress. Radiation exposure activates some, temperature extremes activate others. Atmospheric pressure changes, oxygen deprivation, even specific wavelengths of light can trigger dormant viral sequences to begin transcribing again. And when researchers mapped when these viruses first integrated into the human genome, they found that many entered during periods that align with the catastrophic windows. It is possible that these are simply coincidences. Viruses infect populations during times of stress because weakened immune systems make infection easier. But it is also possible that the timing is not coincidental, that these sequences were not infections in the traditional sense, but biological adaptations. They are packages of genetic code that allowed survival under conditions no modern human has faced. Code that lies dormant now, waiting for the environmental triggers that brought it into existence. What if 8% of your DNA is a backup system? A biological archive designed to activate when the world breaks, when radiation levels spike, and when atmospheric composition shifts to extreme levels. The survivors of Toba did not just endure through luck. They endured because something in their biology allowed them to adapt faster than the environment could kill them. And if that adaptation was written into their DNA, then it is still in ours. 8% of every cell dormant but intact, waiting for conditions that have not existed in 10,000 years. If DNA can carry code, can it carry something else? Something more complex than chemical sequences? Can it carry memory? The idea sounds impossible. Memory is neural, electrochemical, stored in the structure of the brain. It is not genetic. It does not pass from parent to child. And yet, evidence suggests otherwise. Epigenetics has demonstrated that experiences can alter gene expression in ways that are inherited. Trauma experienced by grandparents, famine, war, prolonged stress, shows up in the behavior and physiology of grandchildren who never experienced the original event. The trauma is not remembered consciously, but the body remembers. It responds to threats the grandchild has never faced, as though it has seen them before. This is not memory in the traditional sense. It is not recalling an event. It is carrying a biological imprint of that event forward, encoded in the way genes are expressed, rather than in the sequence of the genes themselves. But if stress responses can be inherited, what else can be? There is a phenomenon that many people experience, but few discuss openly. Déjà rêvé, the feeling that you have dreamed something that later happens, or, more unsettling, the feeling that you are remembering a life you never lived, places you have never been but recognize, events you were not present for but recall with a clarity that feels more than imagination. For most of history, this was dismissed as fantasy, as the brain misfiring, as false memory constructed from fragments of books, films, or conversations half remembered. But what if it is something else? What if, during sleep, when the conscious mind quiets and the logical filters that govern waking thought disengage, something older surfaces? The human genome contains more information than most people realize. The coding sequences, the genes that produce proteins and perform obvious functions, make up less than 2% of the total. The rest was once called junk DNA, assumed to be evolutionary debris with no purpose. But researchers are discovering that much of it is not junk, it is regulatory. It controls when and how other genes activate. It stores information about environmental conditions. It archives responses to threats the body has not faced in generations. What if some of it stores more than responses? What if it stores patterns? Not images or sounds, but impressions. The shape of a coastline, the rhythm of a flood, the cold of ice closing in. Encoded not as memory, but as instinct, as a quiet recognition buried so deep it only surfaces when the conscious mind is not blocking it. You wake from a dream of drowning, not a simple dream of water, but a specific, overwhelming flood. Cities submerged, mountains turning into islands, people fleeing upward, carrying what they can, watching the valleys fill. You have never experienced a flood like that. You have never even read a detailed account, but the terror is precise. The details are sharp. It does not feel invented. It feels remembered. And maybe it is, not your memory, but a memory carried forward, compressed into the genetic archive, decompressing during sleep when the barriers between your conscious mind and the deeper patterns encoded in your cells are thinnest. This is not proven. It cannot be proven with current methods, but it aligns with what has already been demonstrated. That trauma passes down, that instinct carries information across generations, that the body knows things the mind does not. And if the body can remember stress responses, why not the events that cause the stress? We are not blank slates born into a peaceful, stable world with no connection to the deep past. We are the descendants of people who survived the end of worlds, and their survival left marks. In the structure of our genes, in the diversity we lost, in the sequences that activate under stress, in the instincts we carry without understanding why, in the dreams we wake from that feel too real to be fantasy. The catastrophes described in myth are not forgotten. They are written into us, encoded at a level deeper than conscious thought, waiting for the moment when the world begins to break again, and the archive must be accessed. But DNA is invisible. You cannot point to a strand of genetic code and say with certainty, this proves a civilization existed here. It can be interpreted, debated, explained away. The evidence exists, but it is abstract, microscopic, hidden inside cells that most people will never examine. If the survivors wanted to preserve knowledge across a catastrophe, they would need something more direct, something visible. They need stones. And if they arranged that stone with enough precision, encoding enough information in its dimensions and alignments, the message might survive long enough to reach whoever came after. Across the surface of the Earth, in locations separated by oceans and continents, there stand structures so massive and so precise that their existence feels like an accusation against everything we assume about the past. They are not impressive because of their size, though many are enormous. They are impressive because of what their construction implies, a level of knowledge, a degree of coordination, and a purpose that goes beyond shelter or ceremony or the glorification of kings. The Great Pyramid at Giza is not simply large, its base is level to within an inch across more than 13 acres. Its sides are lined to true north with an error of less than 4 minutes of arc, a precision that requires not just observation but sustained calculation and correction over years. The internal passages align with stars that were only in those positions thousands of years before the pyramid was supposedly built. The ratios of its dimensions encode pi, phi, and the proportions of the Earth itself, its diameter, its circumference, even the speed of light when certain measurements are converted to modern units. This is not the work of a civilization learning to stack stones. It is the work of people who understood mathematics, astronomy, and engineering at a level we would not see again until the Renaissance, if then. And the deeper archaeologists excavate beneath the Giza plateau, the older the construction becomes, with techniques that grow more refined the further back they go, as though the pyramid we see today is not the beginning of something, but the end. Thousands of miles across the Pacific, on an island so remote it was discovered by Europeans only in the 18th century, nearly 900 stone figures stand in silence. Easter Island is one of the most isolated places on Earth, a small volcanic triangle surrounded by empty ocean. The statues, moai, are carved from volcanic tuff, some weighing more than 80 tons. They were moved across the island and erected on platforms with a precision that requires knowledge of balance, leverage, and materials. Most face inland, watching over the land, but 7 of them face the sea, positioned at intervals that suggest measurement, not random sea. The islanders who lived there when Europeans arrived had no written history of who carved the statues or why. They spoke of ancestors, of clans, of disputes that led to the toppling of some figures. But the statues themselves are far older than the oral traditions, and the techniques used to create them do not match the tools or methods available to the population encountered by explorers. Something was forgotten, something was lost between the builders and the people who inherited the island. In central Mexico, the city of Teotihuacan stretches across miles of valley floor. It was abandoned long before the Aztecs arrived, and even they did not know who built it. The name they gave the city means place where the gods were created, because they believed only gods could have constructed something so vast. The layout is not arbitrary. The Pyramid of the Sun, the Pyramid of the Moon, and the Avenue of the Dead are positioned according to a pattern that mirrors the spacing of planets in the solar system. The angles align not with the cardinal directions, but with a specific star setting on a particular date, thousands of years in the past. Beneath the Pyramid of the Sun lies a cave, modified into a perfect clover shape, with 4 chambers arranged symmetrically. Natural caves do not form clover shapes. Someone carved it, someone planned it, and someone chose to build the pyramid directly above it, aligning the structure to stars and planets visible only to those who had spent generations studying the heavens. Across the ocean in Southeast Asia, the temple complex of Angkor Wat rises from the jungle, covering an area larger than most medieval European cities. It is not simply a temple, it is a model of the universe rendered in stone. The towers represent the peaks of Mount Meru, the center of the cosmos in Hindu and Buddhist cosmology. The moats and walls correspond to oceans and mountain ranges. The entire structure is oriented to the spring equinox, and the dimensions encode lunar and solar cycles with such precision that modern astronomers have used the temple to reconstruct ancient calendars. And in the windswept plains of southern England, a circle of stones stands in isolation, weathered by millennia, but still aligned with the rising sun on the summer solstice. Stonehenge is smaller than the pyramids, less elaborate than Angkor, but it carries the same signature. The stones are not local. The blue stones were transported from Wales, more than 150 miles away, each weighing several tons. The sarsen stones, even larger, were dragged from quarries 20 miles distant. They were shaped, lifted, and capped with lintels held in place by mortise and tenon joints, woodworking techniques applied to stone. When you plot these sites on a map, Giza, Easter Island, Teotihuacan, Angkor Wat, Stonehenge, and many other stone monuments around the world, they appear scattered, unrelated, the products of separate cultures. But when you begin to measure the distances between them, when you calculate the angles, when you trace the lines, something unexpected emerges. The distances follow ratios, not approximate ratios, but precise mathematical relationships. Some of the angles form geometric patterns, equilateral triangles, pentagons, hexagons, shapes that should not appear unless someone was deliberately designing a network. Certain sites fall along great circles that divide the Earth into equal segments. Others align with smaller circles that intersect at specific points, creating nodes where multiple alignments converge. This is not the result of selective pattern finding. The alignments are measurable, the geometry is consistent, and the sites themselves share characteristics beyond their layouts. Some structures like Machu Picchu, Sacsayhuaman, and Gunung Padang sit on fault lines where seismic activity concentrates. They are built atop geological formations rich in quartz, basalt, and other crystalline minerals. Many shows magnetic anomalies, readings that spike or fluctuate in ways that natural geology alone does not explain. Some researchers have called this a global grid. Others describe it as ley lines, alignments of ancient sites that trace invisible meridians across the planet. The terminology varies, but the observation is consistent. These structures are not isolated monuments. They are nodes in a network, positioned according to principles we no longer understand, but that the builders clearly considered essential. The stones used in construction are not chosen randomly. Granite, basalt, andesite all contain high concentrations of quartz. Quartz is piezoelectric. When pressure is applied, It generates a small electric charge. When subjected to an electric field, it vibrates. The builders knew this, even if they did not name it the way we do. They chose stones that respond to the earth itself, that resonate with seismic activity, that interact with magnetic fields. Why quartz? Why fault lines? Why align to stars that would not be visible to the naked eye without instruments? Some suggest that these sites were designed to tap into the Earth's natural electromagnetic currents, telluric currents, that flow through conductive rock and generate weak but measurable electrical fields. In regions where fault lines intersect, where tectonic plates grind against each other, these currents intensify. The suggestion is that the builders were harnessing this energy, amplifying it through the piezoelectric properties of the stones, creating locations where power, communication, or even consciousness could be concentrated or transmitted. Still others propose that the geometry itself encodes knowledge. The shapes, the ratios, the alignments all serve as a map, a blueprint, a set of instructions for those who know how to read them. Sacred geometry, the ancients called it. Not sacred in the sense of religious, but in the sense of foundational. The patterns that underlie reality itself, rendered visible in stone so that they could not be forgotten, even if the language, the culture, and the civilization that created them vanished entirely. If these sites were part of a global network, if they were positioned deliberately according to principles we have only recently begun to rediscover, then the implication is staggering. It means the builders possessed knowledge of the Earth as a whole. They understood its shape, its magnetic field, its seismic patterns. They communicated across oceans, coordinated construction across continents, and encoded information into stone in ways that would survive long after their cities drowned and their populations scattered. It means that before the cultures we know, something older existed, something organized enough to plan on a planetary scale. If that is true, then every monument we see today is not a beginning. It is an echo of an unknown civilization that was lost. The monuments on land are impressive, but they represent only what survived on high ground. If civilizations rose during the 97% gap, they would not have built exclusively on mountaintops or inland plateaus. They would have settled where resources were abundant, where rivers met the sea, where trade routes converged. They would have built on coastlines, and those coastlines no longer exist where they once were. Sea level is not constant. It never has been. Over the past 300,000 years, the boundary between land and ocean has shifted by hundreds of feet, sometimes rising, sometimes falling, rewriting the shape of continents with every cycle. If you wanted to find traces of lost civilizations, you would not look on the land we occupy today. You would look underwater, along the continental shelves that were dry ground during the last ice age. And when researchers finally began looking there, using sonar, submersibles, and deep scanning equipment, they began finding things that should not exist. Between Southeast Asia and Australia lies a vast submerged plateau known as Sunderland. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, this region was not underwater. It was a landmass larger than India, connecting modern-day Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and the Philippines into a single continuous territory. Rivers meandered across fertile plains, forests stretched from what is now the South China Sea down to the edge of the continental shelf. The climate was temperate, the land rich in resources. It would have been ideal for human settlement. Then the ice melted. Sea levels rose by more than 300 feet over the course of several thousand years, drowning the plains, fragmenting the landmass into islands, and pushing the coastline inward by hundreds of miles. Any cities, any infrastructure, any evidence of organized society that existed on Sunderland is now underwater, buried beneath sediment, eroded by currents, or overgrown by coral. The oral traditions of indigenous groups throughout Southeast Asia contain stories of lands swallowed by the sea, of ancestors fleeing inland as the water rose, of cities abandoned to the waves. For centuries, these were dismissed as myth. But geology confirms that the flooding happened. Sunderland was real, and it drowned. Farther west, between Britain and mainland Europe, another drowned land tells the same story. Doggerland once connected England to France, Germany, and Scandinavia. It was not a barren land bridge. It was a low-lying region of marshes, rivers, and woodlands, home to animals and the humans who hunted them. Fishing trawlers occasionally pull up tools, bones, and worked artifacts from the seabed. They are evidence that people lived there, that they thrived there, until the water rose and erased the landscape entirely. These are not speculative reconstructions. They are documented through bathymetric surveys, sediment cores, and the physical remnants dredged from the ocean floor. The land existed. People lived on it. And when it flooded, everything they built went with it. The question is not whether coastal civilizations drowned. The question is how advanced those civilizations were before the water came. Off the southern coast of Japan, near the island of Yonaguni, divers exploring the seafloor in the mid-1980s encountered something unexpected. At first glance, it appeared to be a natural sandstone formation, weathered by currents and shaped by erosion. But as they traced the contours, the structure began to reveal features that erosion does not produce. Flat terraces rising in steps, parallel grooves carved with uniform depth, right-angle corners where surfaces met at 90 degrees, a platform resembling a pyramid oriented to the cardinal directions. The Yonaguni structure sits at a depth that places it above water roughly 10,000 years ago, during the end of the last ice age. If it is artificial, it would predate the oldest known megalithic architecture by thousands of years. Geologists who have examined the site remain divided. Some argue that the rock layers naturally fracture along planes that create angular shapes. Others point to tool marks, drainage channels, and deliberate modifications that nature does not replicate. What is undeniable is that the structure exists, that it is aligned, and that it sits in a location that was dry land when humans were already present in the region. Whether it was built or merely enhanced by human hands is still debated. But the fact that the debate exists at all is significant. A few decades ago, the idea of submerged architecture older than Sumerian cities would have been dismissed outright. Now it is a question of degree, not possibility. In the shallow waters off the coast of Bimini in the Bahamas, another formation has sparked controversy for more than half a century. Divers call it the Bimini Road, a linear arrangement of limestone blocks extending nearly a kilometre along the seafloor. The blocks are rectangular, uniform in size, and aligned in a way that suggests intentional placement. Some are fitted edge to edge, others show signs of having been shaped or modified. The water is clear, the stones easily visible, and the structure unmistakable. Mainstream archaeology attributes the formation to beach rock, a natural process where calcium carbonate cements loose sediments into solid masses that fracture along regular lines. But beach rock does not typically form straight alignments. It does not produce corners or intersections. And it does not explain the presence of what appear to be anchor stones and carved pillars found near the site. What makes the Bimini Road particularly strange is not just the structure itself, but the timing of its discovery. In the 1930s, a psychic named Edgar Cayce, known for his trance readings and prophecies, made a prediction. He stated that a portion of the lost civilization of Atlantis would be found near Bimini in 1968 or 1969. In 1968, pilots flying over the area spotted the underwater formation and alerted divers. The stones were documented, photographed, and debated. Whether Casey's prediction was genuine foresight, an educated guess based on local legends, or sheer coincidence is unknowable. But the alignment of the date and the discovery is difficult to ignore. Further south, off the northern coast of Cuba, a research team conducting sonar surveys in 2001 detected something far below the surface, at depths exceeding 2,000 feet. The sonar images revealed what appeared to be a massive complex of structures, rectangular formations, pyramid-like shapes, and intersecting pathways arranged in geometric patterns. The images were clear enough that the researchers returned with submersibles to investigate. What they recorded on video was puzzling. Large stone blocks, some smooth and symmetrical, arranged in ways that resembled urban planning. Roads or causeways connecting larger formations, shapes that could be buildings, plazas, or foundations. The depth placed the structures well beyond the reach of sea level changes from the most recent ice age. If they are artificial, they are far older than anything in the accepted timeline, possibly predating the last glacial maximum entirely. The Cuban government restricted further exploration of the site. Official explanations cited concerns about disturbing the area, but permits were not reissued, and independent research teams were denied access. The sonar data remains. The video footage exists, but the site itself has been effectively sealed off from further investigation. Even farther from the known centers of ancient civilization, underwater surveys near the Azores Islands in the Atlantic have identified pyramid-shaped structures rising from the seafloor. Sonar scans suggest symmetrical geometry, flat surfaces, and alignments inconsistent with volcanic activity, which is the dominant geological process in the region. The structures have not been excavated. Funding for deep-water archaeology in remote areas is limited, and proposals to investigate further have been repeatedly declined or ignored. If earlier civilizations built along coastlines that are now submerged, and if those coastlines drowned during the rapid sea level rise at the end of the last ice age, then the archaeological record on land would be incomplete by design. We would be looking in the wrong places, studying the highlands and river valleys while the cities, the ports, and the centers of trade and knowledge lie hundreds of feet underwater, unreachable except through expensive, difficult, and tightly controlled expeditions. The Yonaguni structure sits aligned and terraced in water, shallow enough to dive. Bimini's stones form patterns clear enough to photograph. Cuba's sonar images show geometric precision. The Azores pyramids rise symmetrically from the ocean floor. These are not vague shapes open to wild interpretation. They might be evidence of construction older than any civilization we acknowledge. Each site is a fragment, each fragment part of a larger picture. When the pieces are assembled, the myths aligned across continents, the genetics carried within us, the monuments on land, and the submerged structures along ancient coastlines, then something begins to emerge from the 97% gap. Not one lost civilization, but a sequence. The question is no longer whether earlier civilizations existed. The question is how many cycles have passed, how many worlds rose and fell before the one we call the beginning of history. If these civilizations existed, their names are not written in any textbook. No king lists survive that we acknowledge. No monuments bear inscriptions we can read without controversy. We cannot reconstruct them completely. The gaps are too vast, the erosion too thorough, the time too deep. But we can sketch their outlines. We can identify where they likely rose and what made their locations viable. The oldest whisper of the world's first civilization may come from Sumer itself. Not the Sumer of a few thousand years BC that textbooks mention, but the far deeper shadow of an older belief. According to the cuneiform tablets, humanity was the creation of the Anunnaki, those who came down from heaven, designed for labor. There the number 241,200 years appears as the opening marker of our current human cycle. It is so distant that almost no physical artifact could reasonably survive from that age, yet close enough for the imagination to draw a line between 2 points, the Sumerian texts and the outliers scattered across the archaeological map. Most scholars skim over these passages quickly, filing them under mythology, but if we set aside the literal versus symbolic debate for a moment, if we treat these lines as a clue rather than doctrine, the picture begins to shift. Suddenly a new question emerges. What if this is not divine storytelling, but memory retold in mythic language? In that light, 241,200 years ceases to be a strange number and becomes a plausible span for a first human civilization to have formed. Not wandering bands of hunters with spears, but organized communities with dynasties, laws, crafts, and agriculture. And when that civilization declined, whether from geological upheaval, climatic cycles, or some completely different cause, they may have packed their knowledge into what the later Sumerians called the Me, then passed it on to the next age. The Sumerians insist that they received the Me to rebuild civilization after the Great Flood. They may not have been telling myths for entertainment. They may have been recording a memory, a fragment of a world that stood long before their own. And if that civilization truly existed, its remnants may still lie in those clay tablets, waiting for us to decipher them. Leaving Mesopotamia behind, we pull the map northward to the far edge of the world, toward a frozen blank space that may once have been the center of another civilization. The ancient Greeks whispered about Hyperborea, the land beyond the north wind, where Apollo spent his summers, and where the inhabitants lived long, peaceful lives, untouched by the violence and ambition that consumed the rest of humanity. To them it was myth, but the myth does not float entirely unanchored. Several old maps, such as Ptolemy's in the 2nd century CE, depict mysterious northern territories that some believe could represent Hyperborea. Modern geology has unintentionally added fuel to the idea. Between roughly 125,000 and 120,000 years ago, the Arctic appears to have been almost ice-free, with a climate far warmer than today. Some scholars argue that this is the most plausible window in which Hyperborea could have existed, a ring of land encircling the pole, linking Greenland, Scandinavia, Siberia, and Canada, temperate enough to sustain a long-lived northern civilization. They also suggest that Hyperborea's disappearance resulted from a sudden shift in Earth's axial tilt, turning that once green world into the frozen mass we now call the Arctic. What remains are only fragments, scattered Greek stories, a few nameless shapes on ancient maps, and the wide white emptiness at the top of the globe that we have grown accustomed to calling simply ice. Heading south, we reach another stop on the journey of tracing the footprints of lost civilizations. Today's Sahara is a vast, suffocating sea of sand stretching so far that the horizon dissolves into the glare. But behind that scene lies a completely different memory, a name whispered through many archaeological studies: the Green Sahara. On the rock faces of Tassili Nadja in Algeria, we encounter paintings that make no sense if this land had always been desert. Herds of animals drinking from water sources, groups of people moving across open grasslands, and even images of boats. No one paints boats in sand unless they are seeing water or have only recently lost it. Climate models reconstructed from sediment cores confirm the same strange truth. The Sahara has turned green many times following a cycle of roughly 23,000 years. When Earth's tilt shifts slightly, when its orbit wobbles, the rains return. Rivers flow, lakes fill, grasslands spread. Then the cycle reverses, green, then dry, then green again. After each cycle, whatever civilization stood there was swallowed by sand, like a page turned so violently that the ink never had time to set. Accept that backdrop and a civilization in the Sahara no longer needs to appear once and vanish forever. It could have risen many times, each generation building something new, only to lose everything again when the climate shifted. Memory shattered, passed from group to group, fading a little more after every disaster. Survivors would have been forced to abandon their old centers and drift toward coasts or gentler valleys, carrying with them only fragments of the knowledge they once possessed. Perhaps it was they who later rebuilt the structures we attribute to ancient Egypt, marking the landscape again as if to say, "We were here." And when you look at the Great Pyramid or the Sphinx standing before the desert, it's hard to avoid a sense of unease. Stone blocks fitted so tightly a blade cannot slip between them, walls so straight that crude tools struggle to explain them, weathering patterns that resemble long, heavy rains. All of it forces a question. Who were the true first builders? Were these monuments really born in the age of pharaohs 4,000 years ago, or are they simply the latest reuse of structures first raised by people who lived through earlier cycles of the Green Sahara? To those accustomed to reading history differently, Egypt is not the beginning but the final layer, the thinnest shell atop a civilization that rose and fell so many times that even its last descendants forgot where they had come from. At the other end of the Old World, another civilization rises from beneath the sea. Before the peak of the last glacial maximum, sea levels were hundreds of meters lower than they are today. At that time, all of Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, southern Vietnam, part of Thailand, and the entire South China Sea formed a single, vast landmass that geologists call Sunderland. For those who believe in Mu or Lemuria, that landmass was not just a continental shelf exposed during an ice age, but the visible portion of a sea empire, an eastern Eden, where a civilization both technical and spiritual may have existed some 50,000 years ago. Some theories suggest that traces of that world did not vanish completely. On Gunung Padang in Indonesia, structural layers lie deep beneath the rocky surface, with dates older than 20,000 years. These have led many researchers outside the mainstream to suspect that this hill is not merely a temple, but the summit of a construction far more ancient than the commonly accepted timeline. If we see it as an observatory, it's easy to imagine its role in tracking the changes that coastal dwellers would have cared about: the rise and fall of massive tides, unpredictable climatic cycles, the moment when the ice began to retreat and the seas started to rise. Farther east, scattered dots across the Pacific map evoke the same motif. Nan Madol, with its basalt blocks stacked into walls and canals right at the water's edge. The underwater stone steps of Yonaguni, which look like the remains of a structure already submerged. The Moai statues on Easter Island turning their backs to the ocean as if marking a route their descendants have long since forgotten. Taken alone, each site is a local mystery. Placed side by side, they form a network of ports or observation stations, as though they once served a consistent building tradition before rising seas drowned almost everything. Whether Mu really existed or is only the shadow that scholars like James Churchward tried to name, no one can say for sure. The answer is probably still lying somewhere beneath the deep blue water of the Pacific, waiting to surface. The closest lost civilization to us in time may be Atlantis. According to Plato, it was a radiant continent lying beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar. This powerful empire was said to have flourished around 11,000 BC, only to be erased from the map in a single catastrophic day and night of misfortune, sometime around 9600 BC. Long afterward, when researchers revisited Plato's chronology, they noticed something striking. His dates align neatly with the end of the Younger Dryas, the abrupt climate shift that occurred roughly 11,600 years ago. From that overlap emerged hypotheses of comet impacts, collapsing ice sheets, global tsunamis, and Atlantis was placed squarely within that window of upheaval, like a missing piece of the post-Ice Age puzzle. In the expanded versions of this legend, Atlantis was far more than a wealthy nation. It becomes a civilization that manipulated energy in a fundamentally different way. They were said to use giant crystals and electromagnetic towers to regulate local climate, facilitate long-distance communication, and influence neighboring regions. Their capital, or at least one of their major cities, was described as a series of concentric rings of land and water, interconnected by canals and harbors. That image inevitably invites comparison to several unusual formations recorded around the Atlantic, from the coasts of Morocco to the waters near the Azores. Different sources often divide Atlantean history into two phases. The early period is portrayed as a time of balance, when knowledge and spirituality moved in harmony and technology served as a tool to keep human life attuned to the rhythms of the earth. Later, the tone shifts: growing ambition, militarization, expansionist campaigns, and the use of climatic or energetic manipulation as a kind of soft power. That is when the rules of the game were broken and nature's cycles began to respond. One or more impacts, followed by cascading geological events, sent most of the continent beneath the sea. Yet in many versions of the story, the tale does not end there. Myths scattered across Western Europe, North Africa, and Central America speak of teachers, of people from a distant sea who arrived to guide local populations, teaching them how to raise stone, read the sky, and keep the calendar. Seen through an Atlantean lens, these are the survivors. One branch drifting into Western Europe, leaving traces in Druidic traditions and megalithic lines such as Stonehenge and Karnak. Another moving into North Africa and the Levant, merging with pre-dynastic Egyptian communities. Another crossing the Atlantic, leaving faint signatures in motifs of the Olmec and the Maya that seem almost too sophisticated for the linear evolutionary model we are accustomed to. Ongoing efforts to track down Atlantis are still a serious pursuit for many survey teams and clue hunters. One area after another in the Atlantic and even the Black Sea and parts of South America has been proposed, measured, and drilled. But so far, the true foundations of Atlantis have yet to be found, still lying somewhere beneath the water and sediment on the ocean floor. The sixth civilization might have been the people who withdrew deep underground into cave systems and subterranean cities, but perhaps they were not a separate species at all, just the remnants of earlier civilizations that had already endured multiple cycles of cataclysm. Each time disaster struck, some groups did not flee across the surface. They went downward. The deeper they went, the farther they were from storms, tsunamis, melting ice, or falling fire. It sounds like myth until you see places like Derinkuyu. Beneath the Cappadocia region of Turkey lies an entire underground city carved almost 85 meters deep, spanning 18 levels below the surface. Inside are ventilation shafts, wells, food, storage rooms, chapels, communal spaces, even areas believed to be classrooms. Estimates suggest it could shelter up to 20,000 people for extended periods, and Derinkuyu is not an isolated case. Surrounding it is a vast network of other underground cities, all connected by tunnels stretching for miles through solid rock. Official history explains them as hiding places for early Christian communities escaping persecution. That explanation isn't wrong, but it doesn't have to be the whole story. A refuge engineered with such precision could just as easily represent the latest reuse of a far older shelter, one originally built to survive extreme upheavals we no longer remember. Follow the old stories and the motif of people beneath the earth appears again and again. The Hopis say their ancestors were led deep underground by the ant people to survive a time of fire and darkness, only returning to the surface through a portal at the Grand Canyon. In Central Asia and the Himalayas, names like Agartha and Shambhala describe inner-world kingdoms, supposed homes of communities that retreated below the surface after great disruptions. These fragments do not give us a precise map, but placed side by side, they outline a possibility. After each time Earth's surface was overturned, there were always groups who carried knowledge, technology, and memory from the previous age, descending into layers of protective stone and living through generations in relative darkness until the surface was safe again. These 6 are the most commonly proposed in alternative histories, the most pattern, the most fragments of evidence pointing in the same direction. But they may not be the only ones. Every few years another layer emerges. Beneath the ice sheets of Antarctica, radar penetration reveals what might be mountain ranges or what might be structures too geometric to be natural. In the Amazon basin, LiDAR scans cutting through jungle canopy expose vast networks of earthworks, causeways and mounds stretching for hundreds of miles, suggesting populations and coordination far beyond scattered villages. Along the submerged shelves of the Caribbean, divers occasionally report stone formations that resemble roads, foundations, always in places that were dry land during the last ice age. The pattern repeats. Every time researchers look closer, another possibility surfaces. Every time sonar sweeps a new section of ocean floor, another anomaly appears. Every time ground-penetrating radar scans a desert or a jungle, geometric shapes emerge where there should be nothing but geology. Whether these represent 6 lost civilizations or 10 or 20, no one can say with certainty. The further back you look, the more the evidence dissolves into ambiguity, but the ambiguity itself tells a story. It suggests that what we call the beginning may only be the latest chapter, that the 97% gap is not empty, it is erased, and every discovery pulls back another layer, revealing not answers, but deeper questions. At least 6 before us, possibly more, civilizations we will never know existed because they were erased beyond recovery. The myths spoke of cycles, the catastrophes demonstrated the mechanism, the stones marked the locations, the DNA carried the scars, the evidence scattered but consistent. So why do mainstream institutions dismiss these connections as fringe speculation? Why does the investigation of earlier civilizations meet resistance at every turn? The silence is not accidental, it is structural, and understanding why it exists reveals as much about our present as the ruins reveal about our past. In 1909, the Arizona Gazette published an account of explorers discovering vast cave systems in the Grand Canyon, carved with passages extending miles into the cliffs, containing artifacts and symbols that resembled nothing native to North America. The Smithsonian Institution reportedly sent a team. Then the story disappeared. No follow-up article, no published findings. Requests to explore the caves have been denied for over a century. The area remains restricted. The official position is that the story was a hoax, though no retraction was ever printed and no evidence of fabrication ever presented. This is not an isolated incident. A researcher in Japan spends years documenting the Yonaguni structure, measuring its angles, photographing its terraces, compiling data that suggests intentional construction. Funding for further dives is quietly redirected, Academic papers on the site are rejected by mainstream journals without detailed review. The site itself remains accessible to tourists, but serious archaeological investigation has stalled for decades, caught in a loop of permits. This leads to a question many researchers are reluctant to ask aloud. Why would anyone suppress evidence of earlier civilizations? Why would institutions dedicated to uncovering the past resist discoveries that challenge the accepted timeline? One answer appears in the structure of academic careers. A professor spends 30 years building a reputation on the assumption that civilization began 12,000 years ago. Textbooks are written, theories are constructed, tenure is earned. Then evidence surfaces suggesting complexity existed 50,000 years earlier. Accepting that evidence means acknowledging that the foundation was wrong, that the textbooks must be rewritten, that the theories must be abandoned, that decades of work rest on incomplete assumptions. It is not a comfortable position, and so the instinct, conscious or not, is to resist, to question the evidence more harshly than it might deserve, to delay acceptance until the resistance itself becomes untenable. This is not malice. It is inertia, but the effect is the same. Another answer appears in places where ruins lie near strategic coastlines. A government discovers sonar anomalies in waters that fall within its territorial boundaries. The formations sit atop geological features that might indicate mineral deposits, geothermal energy sources, or tectonic activity worth monitoring. If those formations also suggest ancient engineering beyond known capabilities, the discovery becomes valuable. Not academically, but strategically. What can be learned from precision stonework that predates known technology? What does it reveal about materials, methods, or principles that competitors have not yet considered? The site is classified. Research is restricted to approved personnel. Data is collected but not published. And the formations remain hidden, not to protect the public, but to protect the advantage. And then there is a third answer, quieter and more unsettling. If the general population learned that at least 6 civilizations rose before ours, that each believed itself permanent, that each collapsed when forces beyond their control reasserted themselves, the psychological impact could be severe. Economies function on confidence. Societies operate on the assumption that progress continues, that tomorrow is more stable than today, that the future extends forward in an unbroken line. The revelation that we are merely the latest iteration in a cycle of rises and falls, and that the cycle remains active, could destabilize systems built on the illusion of permanence. Perhaps those who control access to sensitive discoveries believe they are protecting the public from a truth it is not prepared to handle. Perhaps they believe they are buying time. Whether this paternalism is justified or condescending does not change the outcome. The information remains restricted, the discoveries remain marginal, and the timeline stays intact, defended not by evidence but by institutional weight. But the cycle does not wait for consensus. It does not pause while institutions debate what can be acknowledged. The forces that erased at least 6 civilizations before ours are not dormant because we choose not to discuss them. They operate on timescales that dwarf the lifespan of any government, any academic generation, any institution built on the assumption of stability. And if the pattern documented in ice cores and sediment layers is real, those forces are stirring again, not in centuries, but in decades. The signs are already here, and they do not care whether we acknowledge them. The ice shelf calves. A section the size of a city breaks free from the Antarctic coast, captured by satellite in real time. The footage plays on news channels for 3 days. Scientists comment, the public watches. Then the story fades, replaced by the next headline, and the ice shelf is forgotten. But the ice does not forget. It continues. Greenland loses mass at rates that exceed projections made only 5 years earlier. Glaciers that have remained stable for 10,000 years thin and retreat. The melting is not gradual, it accelerates. Summer after summer, the measurements exceed the previous year. And while the data accumulates in journals and reports, the ancient ice disappears into the ocean, taking its archive with it. The magnetic field drifts. Not slowly, as it has for centuries, but noticeably. The North Magnetic Pole has shifted more in the last 2 decades than it did in the previous 100 years. Navigation systems require constant updates. Migratory species that depend on magnetic cues show signs of disorientation, and the field itself, measured by satellites and ground stations, weakens, not uniformly, but in patches, as though the protective shell around the planet is thinning in places, allowing solar radiation to penetrate more deeply than it has in recorded history. Whether this signals the beginning of a reversal or merely another excursion is unknown. Beneath the oceans, currents that have circulated for millennia begin to stutter. The Gulf Stream slows. Temperature readings show anomalies, cold zones appearing where warmth should flow, warm zones where cold should dominate. The thermohaline circulation, which regulates climate across entire hemispheres, grows erratic. Scientists publish papers, models are updated, but the currents themselves do not wait for understanding. They shift. And with them, weather patterns reorganize, storms intensify, droughts persist longer. Rainfall arrives in regions unprepared for it, and vanishes from regions that depend on it. The changes are not theoretical, they are measurable. Ecosystems respond, species migrate toward the poles, abandoning ranges they occupied for thousands of years. Flowering times shift earlier, migration routes change, coral reefs bleach across entire ocean basins, their symbiotic algae expelled by water temperatures that exceed tolerable thresholds. Forests in temperate zones die back, unable to adapt quickly enough to shifting precipitation and heat. Deserts expand, ice-dependent species lose habitat within a single generation, and throughout all of this, the official response is to frame the changes as environmental issues, scientific models, policy debates. But viewed in the context of the catastrophic windows that preceded every earlier collapse, these changes appear as something older, something cyclical, the beginning of another turning. But there is one difference between this moment and all the moments that came before. We can see the pattern. For the first time in the 300,000-year history of Homo sapiens, one civilization in the sequence possesses the tools to look backward across deep time and recognize the cycle. The question is whether seeing changes anything, whether knowledge provides an advantage that might allow this iteration to endure where others did not. The answer is uncertain. The forces that govern the cycle are indifferent to human awareness. Ice advances whether we acknowledge it or not. Magnetic fields weaken regardless of our measurements. Seas rise without waiting for consensus. But awareness creates the possibility of preparation, not escape. There is nowhere on the planet immune to these forces, not prevention. The mechanisms are too vast, too deeply embedded in planetary systems for any civilization to stop them. But adaptation, the capacity to encode knowledge in forms designed to outlast catastrophe, to decentralize systems so that the collapse of one region does not cascade into the collapse of all, to teach the pattern itself so that if the reset comes, the survivors know they are rebuilding, not beginning. If we succeed, this could be the first iteration to break the cycle, not by preventing the turning, but by surviving it with enough intact that the knowledge does not degrade entirely, that the next rise, if there is one, begins from memory rather than fragments, that the wheel, if it cannot be stopped, can at least be recognized for what it is. If we fail, we become what those before us became. Another layer in the geological record. Another set of anomalies future archaeologists will debate. Another myth passed down by survivors too scattered to preserve coherence, distorted by time, until it sounds like fantasy rather than warning. The stones we build will erode, the cities will be buried or drowned. And 10,000 years from now, or 50,000, another civilization will rise, believing itself to be the first, wondering at the strange precision of ruins they cannot explain, and the stories that describe worlds ending in ways that feel too familiar to be entirely invented. The ice continues its work. The field continues to weaken. The currents shift. The ecosystems reorganize. And somewhere in the pattern of all these changes, the question waits. Not whether the cycle will turn, it is turning now, but whether, for the first time, one civilization in the sequence will turn with it, prepared and deliberate, rather than be caught the way all the others were, believing that permanence was ever possible. The signs are here. The choice, such as it is, belongs to those willing to see them.